did it already.
Do another one.
Wait.
Online. Are we
The
good?
camera was smudged, yeah. I think we're good. Sorry, folks.
Yeah. Okay, hello everybody, welcome to the space. Great to see such a packed room, and welcome to our folks online who are joining us. We're really pleased to launch the latest issue of the New York War Crimes in collaboration with WAWOG, and have this event and discussion on India and Israel and the history of collaboration, looking at the kind of long and sinister history between these two states. I'm just going to be your MC for the event, so you're not going to hear too much of me, hopefully. I just want to introduce SALAM first. We are one of the co-organizers of the event. We are a left political organization based here in New York City, and we engage with ongoing struggles and movements in South Asia, but also beyond. We are an internationalist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist organization. And as we see the rising and the entrenchment of capitalism and fascism in South Asia, we're also seeing a long history of progressive organizing in the region, from Bangladesh to Kashmir to Sri Lanka, and we want to see how we can broaden those connections. Obviously, like many of you, over the last 10 months, a lot of our focus has been thinking about how we organize and think critically about how we pool our resources for Palestinian liberation. And this event really comes out of a lot of that thinking and work that we've been doing in collaboration with many of you here. So it's great to see so many of you. I'm also just going to introduce WAWOG. Probably doesn't need much introduction, but I'm gonna do the intro. WAWOG Writes Against the War in Gaza, works to expose cultural complicity with Zionism and American imperialism. As writers and culture workers, WAWOG knows that speech can both inform and take the form of action. That old oppressive narratives must crumble as new consciousnesses grow. Through their communications, labor, popular education, and PACB committees, WAWOG fights the narrative war and holds Palestine at the center of public intention. Put your hands up if you've read a past issue of WAWOG's New York War Crimes. Yeah, pretty much everyone. Well, most people here. And if you haven't, then you're gonna read your first one today. I also want to thank Asian American Writers Workshop and Mohammed, who's been amazing, and this space, which is incredible, for having us here as well. So I'm just going to run through the agenda today. We will be hearing a little bit from different comrades who are going to be talking deeper into this relationship. We'll hear from WAWOG and the kind of history of how it came to be. We'll be having a Q&A session as well. And then obviously, most importantly, this is not just a discussion. We want to think and invite you all to join our campaign so we take us out of discussion spaces and onto the streets. So that's the agenda for today. And of course, as always, just treat each other with the respect that you would like in the Q&A session. Keep it short, keep it questions, like everybody have in the space. Our moderators know if you go on for too long, they will interrupt you, so no grandstanding. And obviously we want critical conversation because that's what builds our movement, but hostile, discriminatory language is not welcome in this space as well. So that's everything. Finished with all the housekeeping stuff. I'm going to move us on to the real part of the event, and I'm going to introduce my comrade at SALAM, Sami, to come to the stage.
Thanks, Maite. We're a little quiet. From the river to the sea. From the river to the sea. No, come on. From the river to the sea. From the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. Palestine will be free. From the sea to the river. From the sea to the river. Palestine will live forever. Palestine will live forever. From the sea to the river. From the sea to the river. Palestine will live forever. Palestine will live forever. Good evening. Welcome to the launch of the New York War Crimes Volume 2, number 12. My name is Sami, and I will be grounding and framing today's program for us. First and foremost, we ground ourselves in the remembrance of our martyrs in Gaza. We ground ourselves in the memory of the martyrs in Jenin. We ground ourselves in the steadfastness of the Palestinian people. And as the Zionist genocide continues, as Zionist raids across the West Bank continue, and as the complicity of this violent imperial American government continues, we ground ourselves in the obligation to turn our grief into action. Today, the IOF murdered Aisha Noor Azghiagi with a targeted gunshot wound to the head while she was participating in a protest against an illegal Israeli settlement in the south of Nablus. Aisha Noor was a Turkish activist from Seattle, 26 years old, known to many in this city. May her memory always be a blessing, and her legacy one of justice. Today in Jenin, in the West Bank, after 10 days of the destruction of the city, after 10 days of unrelenting resistance by its fighters, the masses took to the streets to bid farewell to their martyrs. Jenin has always been and continues to be a thorn in the throat of the occupier. Today marks the 3rd anniversary of the Palestinian Freedom Tunnel on 6 September 2021, where 6 Palestinian prisoners, sons of Jenin, liberated themselves from this high-tech, highly surveilled Gilboa prison with just the aid of spoons. Woo! MashaAllah. Just as on October 7th, brave Palestinian fighters have exposed this paper tiger that is the Zionist entity. Their supposed technological superiority can and will be defeated. Next month, October 7th, will mark 1 year since the defeat of the Al-Aqsa flood, 1 year of struggle, 1 year of fierce resistance by the Palestinian people, nearly 1 year of witnessing from the heart of empire, of struggling in the streets of New York City, of mobilizing and organizing against the occupier, Israel and the United States alike. As an organization rooted in the liberation of South Asia, we have a particular duty to target another settler colonial entity as well, one that sees itself in Israel and materially furthers the occupation of Palestine, India. This insidious relationship draws out the parallels between these evil empires and gets to the heart of our issue. This is why we mobilize our community. This is why SALAM and WAWOG published it. And this is where we hope to take this campaign. We channel our analysis into action. For decades, India has suppressed the self-determination of the Kashmiri people, just as the Zionist entity has suppressed the self-determination of the Palestinians. So we begin our issue. I hope everyone has had a chance to look through it. We begin our issue with words from the poem Rebellion by the martyr Abdul Sattar Ranjur, one of the founders of the Communist Party in Kashmir, and who was materially involved with the militant 1946 Quit India movement. In 1970, he wrote this poem to honor the Palestinian resistance, which was at new heights of militancy, just as it is today. We hear his words to the annals of history. We hear his words echo today, and we think of it, we know of it as a sacred duty of ours to fulfill. Guided by the work of Comrade Azad Essa, who you'll hear from today, he has worked tirelessly for years to expose the sinister collaboration between India and Israel. We frame this issue as an ideological, military, and tactical matter. One that gets misused and misrepresented and mischaracterized, but one that is insidious in and of itself. We reviewed the work of Indian labor unions who are attempting to build solidarity with Palestine under draconian conditions. Hafsa, who you'll also hear from today, shares her experience of coming into political consciousness of her own Kashmiri identity through the Palestinian experience. through being active in the Palestine movement. This is a sacred bond. What's most important in our issue is a call to action. We sit in a room that's full of books, that's full of analysis, that's full of the advice of elders. We must move that advice. We must move that wisdom to action. And that's why later today, you'll hear about us targeting the behemoth, the ugly, sinister, violent behemoth that is Dada, that is supporting the Zionist genocide in Gaza. It's critical that we use the words that we describe in this issue to channel our grief, to channel our strength into action. Hashtag Tata Bye Bye. There is only one solution. 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 Intifada revolution. Intifada revolution. Intifada, intifada. Intifada, intifada. Intifada, intifada. Intifada, intifada. Thank you so much. With that, we're going to welcome our partner org, who was instrumental in writing and publishing and proliferating this issue, Writer Against the War on Gaza, to the stage.
WAWOG.
Can people see us?
Do you
if we
guys
sit
feel
down here?
comfortable with us sitting, or do you want us standing?
Do you guys want chairs?
You want to sit on the
Would you like chairs? You can sit on the couch.
Yeah.
Nobody likes down there.
We just don't want to block your view. Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's so wonderful to see this room packed the way that it is, because this was an issue that was a first for WAWOG. This is our first time collaborating with an outside organization. So to see it be received so well has been really heartwarming. Our 12th issue, and this being our first partner org, has been great. I'm going to assume a lot of folks know what the war crimes is, but if you're not familiar with the war, with our organization itself, it's Writers Against the War on Gaza. And what we are is cultural workers who are building a new scaffolding for a cultural front for Palestine in the imperial core. When we think about that imperial core, what comes to mind first off? It's the US and the government's complicity in everything that is happening. But one thing we believe strongly within WAWOG is that the media and our participation in media is just as complicit, if not equal. If we were organized against what mainstream media was putting out in stronger ways, we would have been able to see a lot of narratives push back in our favor. So what does engaging with the imperial core look like for us here at WAWOG? It has been a multitude of different things, but one of the things that really sits well in our org that everyone kind of adheres to is, I know when we talk about writers, we have the pen is mightier than the sword. Something that everyone here understands is that first is resistance. Whatever resistance is using to fight back against imperialism is what we adhere to, and we kind of follow in the footsteps with our pen, with that imagery, to sort of put back stones and where they're overturning. So in that regard, one of our biggest initiatives is PACB. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PACB, but I saw a hand go up. That's great. I'm glad someone is familiar with PACB. But it's basically the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So we know in the past that divesting from entities that are engaging in imperialism is one of the primary ways we target what that institution is. And anytime you hear either one of us say Israel here, just know that the air quotes are implied. I'm not going to continue, but Israel itself. So when we talk about boycotting these cultural institutions, what are we putting in place to make sure that there are things that people can engage in? Whether we like it or not, folks in America are going to engage in mainstream media. They're going to engage in art. They're going to engage in theater. we've seen a little shift on celebrity culture, which has been really nice, but they're going to engage in these things whether we tell them to or not. So what are we putting in place to make sure that they have alternatives? And that's sort of where the war crimes has come about. It's an alternative space to what people recognize as mainstream. The first edition, I think,
I think if you want to.
yes, let's look at this edition here. So this was the first one released in November. I myself was not part of WAWOG at that time, but I remember when the Gaza Health Ministry released these names. These were 7,000 names of people martyred by Israel in November. And I remember seeing this list, and at that time, the protests were very frequent, and we would often pass the New York Times within our route. And I'm standing there, like I would stand here and etch each one of these names into the glass of the New York Times if I could. And then by magic, 2 days later, I saw someone, we were passing the Times, and they had this issue in their hand. And I was like, it was one of the few moments in that beginning of this advanced aggression where I felt a bit like, okay, there's organization happening against the narratives that the New York Times is portraying. To be able to see something so powerful in someone's hands, the names of every single person at this point could not fit in this edition. And it was 7,000. And now we are at 186,000 martyrs. And that number is even seeming to be larger than that. And all of this, there is a big component in media being complicit in this even existing, in this even being a list of names that has to be on a screen. So the war crimes itself, you can basically call it a protest. The paper is a protest against the complicity of mainstream media. That's pretty much how it started. It started as taking what the New York Times is and spinning it on its head. There's also historical anecdotes, which Sohini will also touch on a bit later, that existed in the past that we've kind of built on at the New York war crimes. But this paper in and of itself can be considered a protest. Everything that is published in this edition and previous editions are politically in line with people who came before us, with revolutionaries before us, people on the ground before us, and we just have the, I guess, pleasure and honor to continue this sort of work in this way for the war crimes. Something that is interesting about the evolution of the crimes is, yes, it started as a protest, but it's sort of what we were talking about and referred to now as rightful appropriation. So finally using white supremacy against itself, because if you look at, we can go one slide forward, actually. If you look at it right off the bat, take it for face value, and you're not really sure what's being handed to you, it looks like the Times. We actually did notice this when we were distributing editions at the India-Israel Day Parade. If you notice any of the photos that came out of that event, there's a couple of uncles like standing there with a paper, just like reading on the side of the road. And that looks posed, and I promise you it's not. We were standing actually laughing at the fact that they were reading every article in the paper and actually digesting what was in it. And so it kind of works out as a tool because, one, the generation that tends to feed into mainstream propaganda, that feeds into mainstream narratives, is that older generation, and they do happen to love having print in their hands. So you kind of get two birds, one stone in that regard. They think they're reading the Times, and that's fine with us. We don't care that they think that, as long as the information is going somewhere. So in that way, I guess we get to use the likeness of them and use that as a tool, which is also really great. We can go, this is an edition that came out recently, and I'm going to touch on this in a bit. This can stay up on the screen. So there's three main things that the war crimes does currently. One of those things is countering propaganda. Maybe at some point of this slide, you might see the cover that was manufacturing consent for genocide. That was one of our first issues, our January 12th issue, I believe, that countered the Screams Without Words article. And I'm sure many of us have heard about Scream Without Words. And that article basically is an entire piece of propaganda that reiterates mass rape that Hamas conducted on October 7th, which we know to not be true, was debunked multiple times, even by Israeli media themselves. And currently, we are still in our pursuit of advocating for the New York Times to retract this article, Screams Without Words. And if you've wanted to be involved in any WAWOG initiatives, this is a great place to get involved. You can reach out to either one of us later on. We are still asking the Times to revoke this article, retract it, and we are advancing against Joseph Kahn, who is the executive director, to also have this removed from it. And we are pushing for them to release an editorial on an arms embargo. So hopefully that's a good sign and the article will be retracted. Let's take it as that.
That was Joe Kahn's last breath.
That was Joe Kahn's response, and the only response we care about. But yes, if you'd like to get involved, this is an ongoing initiative that will be taking place almost weekly, and it's a great area for folks to cross over and do work with us as well. So that's number one thing. We're countering propaganda with the war crimes. The second main thing we do is pass the mic and intervening with things that are happening on the ground. So an example of this, let's see if we have the student edition cover up here. I think it's a little bit backwards. The student
Back one to the right. Oh. It's just the pictures of, there we go.
Okay, perfect. So we have the issue that we did that covered the student encampments. And what's really nice about that piece is we even had an article in there written by Palestinian students or that were in the Palestinian universities in Gaza, and they wrote letters to the students who are protesting here. So being able to have an issue like that where folks can actually cross over on the ground is just an amazing space to have. And the last thing that we do is we basically use it as a tool for agitprop and to connect struggles. So back to our Juneteenth issue, which is forward, our Juneteenth, which is here. This was a really great example of using the war crimes as a tool to connect struggles. This was the first edition that we did that did accomplish that. And the reason that I found this edition really special, and it saw it again with the India-Israel issue, is because we were able to reach people that don't engage on the ground. They're not at the protest necessarily. A friend and I actually took these editions to Southside Jamaica, where folks, just for socioeconomic reasons, are not able to conceptualize what the Palestinian movement is because they are in their own struggle and resistance day to day on their own. But when they saw this edition and they were able to read about Black liberation, Black love, Black revolution, those dots, you can visibly see it connecting on their face, the way that they can make the connections between people's struggles. So when we did have the issue out with India and Israel, that was seen again, what I just mentioned, we were seeing uncles reading on the street. There was like a grandma and her kids showing some of the artistry that was in the piece. It may not be exact political education in the way that we've grown to know it or that we operate in spaces like this, but it's incredibly vital for folks that may not be within that reach. So that's pretty much an overview of what we've got at the war crimes and the WAWOG overall. Pass over to Sohini.
Thank you, Shay. Yeah, I can imagine that people might have the question, why focus so intently on the New York Times? They're certainly not the only ones manufacturing consent for genocide. They're certainly not the only ones abysmal in their coverage. So why is it that WAWOG has chosen to really zero in on the New York Times in this way? And there are a few answers to that question. The first is that we're definitely inspired by the original New York. Are you hearing that echo? Is that just me? We're definitely inspired by the original New York crimes, the Project of Grand Fury, which is an artist collective that arose out of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and their original project, which was really focused on exposing the malfeasance of the Times' coverage or lack of coverage of the AIDS crisis. So the strategy there was to kind of expose the omissions of the time, expose its homophobia, its complete disintention to cover the AIDS epidemic completely in the beginning of the 80s, and then also kind of dislodge the Times' reputation as the paper of record. So those were really the two strategies of the original New York crimes, and we've definitely drawn inspiration from that project for our own work. And that's one thing that hasn't really changed since the 80s. The New York Times is still very much the paper of record. And I think we have, if we go a couple slides forward, here's a picture of folks protesting at an ACT UP protest. You can see in someone's hand they're holding a New York crimes sign. And then the next slide is actually an image of the original New York crimes. And if you take a look at the headlines, you can really see that it's a project in focusing on the omissions of the original, of the New York Times. So the headlines, the coverage, it's imagining what would it look like if the New York Times had actually covered the AIDS crisis? What would it have looked like for journalism to do its job in this moment? How can we piece together the story of the organized abandonment of the people who were most impacted by the AIDS crisis? So we definitely draw inspiration from the original New York crimes. And as I said, things haven't necessarily changed so much since the 80s. It's very much still the paper of record, despite its many, many failures, despite its failure in covering the AIDS epidemic, despite, its insistence on publishing the most bland recipes possible in its cooking section. Despite all of that, it's the paper of record, both in the United States and more broadly in the Western world. It's cited by Zionists justifying their war crimes all the time, as Shay mentioned, screams without words. The specter of mass rape used to say, we are justified in any intention to eradicate Hamas, no matter the cost, no matter the toll, no matter the spread of polio, no matter how many children die. So that's the function of the New York Times. Not only is it exemplary of the Western media's malfeasance in its coverage of the genocide, but it's unmatched in its prestige and in that function. And that prestige is really where it gets its power to do so much harm. But it's also something that we can use for our own aims. So the New York war crimes functions by weaponizing the widespread recognition of the New York Times as this voice of authority and then stealing that voice of authority for our own purposes. So it actually works. The reason people read the New York war crimes is because it looks like the New York Times, as Shay was saying. You're going to a protest, a random Trotskyist is handing you a flyer. You're not reading that. You're not reading that shit. So for it to look like the Times actually encourages people to take a look at what we're saying, there's a very practical appropriation in that way. And it's really remarkable to watch. I can't count the number of times I've handed someone the New York war crimes. I've seen that initial, sure, I'll take a look. It's the Times. There's that level of trust there. And then there's the shock and surprise when they realize it's not what they thought it was. And then the curiosity to kind of keep reading and probably read more than they otherwise would have because of that initial trick. And I think the lesson there is that when you have to look twice, you have to look differently. And that's really what we weaponize in sort of stealing the voice of authority and stealing the visual language of the New York Times for our own purposes. And that's not a new idea. That's not something that we invented. Obviously, the original the New York Crimes exists. Okay, low on time. I'll keep it moving. That's not an idea that we invented. I think appropriation and that kind of expropriation are kind of really profound tools of anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance. I wonder, I'm so curious what it is. So those are tools of anti-colonial resistance, not just that we're using, but used across the board. WAWOG is not guerrilla fighters, but to kind of exemplify the point, I think it's helpful to think about the way in which so many of the literal weapons used by the Palestinian resistance used to be Israeli weapons that have now been appropriated. So I want to leave us with that thought, and I know we have to move a little bit quickly, but want to share a reflection from the writer and organizer Avram Finkelstein, one of the New York Crimes' original architects, who told us in an interview that the fundamental problem with the Times, whether with AIDS or with Israel and Palestine, is that it presents a narrative that is determined to serve power structures. Their narratives are invariably in service of power, not resistance to power. So therefore, the resistance needs to build its own counter-narratives and renegotiate the forces of power. So that's definitely the aspiration of the project. That's what the work we have ahead of us, not just for those working on the New York war crimes, but anyone who's interested in this work more broadly.
The last thing that we just want to leave you with before we go, there's one more slide at the ending here. If you would like to get involved with our October 7th edition at all, you can in terms of donating to the process of getting it completed, you can use this QR code later on. And on your chairs, there's a flyer. One of the flyers is about the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. We are currently fundraising to send funds to them in the Gaza. So if you can donate, please do. There's a QR code on that flyer. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you so much. And it was amazing to work with our comrades of WAWOG, who are working so hard to providing us with an alternative media that we so desperately need. This is why we shout in the street, every time the media lies, a neighborhood in Gaza dies. Every time the media lies. A neighborhood in Gaza dies. I'm now going to introduce my comrade Ira, who's going to be talking us through the timeline that is in your papers. This was something that was really important to us to kind of show the long history of this collaboration between India and Israel. And yeah, we're just going to hit a little bit more in detail.
Thank you, Magdi, and thank you everyone for coming to this event. And I've been tasked with the job of kind of just grounding us and giving us a baseline overview of the history of the collaboration between India and Israel. In this, if you look through the second page, you'll see the timeline there, or you can look at it here, the not so brief history of the sinister and insidious collaboration between two colonial nation states. So I'm going to start by sort of just characterizing the overall relationship. And this is something that we've been able to put together, and you can also read it in Azad's book, Hostile Homelands. He's done a wonderful job of just meticulous. It's a really robust history of the relationship between the two countries. And you know, he describes it as a relationship that is based on strategy, geopolitical strategy, rather than something that's based on, you know, a moral compass or anti-colonialism, etc., etc. So, you know, as in newly independent nation in 1947, when India became independent, resisting the British, the first thing that the Indian state does is, along with rejecting Israel's admission to the UN in 1948, they also come out against the partition of Palestine. And so this is something that is often spoken about as something that, you know, as a newly established country, it was in India's strategic advantage to come out and posture itself as anti-colonial third world leader of international solidarity against for all third world anti-colonial movements. And so that is how India starts off. But at the same time, the reality of the Indian state that it's a post-colonial colonizer that has been asserting this sort of a colonial occupation upon indigenous people and territories within India. So its treatment of Kashmir, other frontier regions in the northeast, all point to a colonial tactic. And I'd like you to for a moment consider the idea that India in itself is inherently colonial. So in so many ways, if you think about it, the alliance between India and Israel is a very, very natural one. It makes sense that these two countries, nation states, would be ideologically aligned. But it's important to understand that the history of the collaboration is not particularly one that is rooted in ideology, but rather it complements the ideological alliance complements the strategic advantage that India has been able to, and both countries, it's a symbiotic relationship, and both of them have been able to get from each other. So I'm gonna walk folks through like this is like broadly three broad categories of what the relationship looked like between these countries. And this is not like, you know, like a really like set in stone sort of a category. It's just so that I don't have to read the entire timeline for you, and we can sort of just look at phases of the relationship rather than go through individual activities that have happened. I will talk about some individual tactics and actions and activities that fall under those particular categories, but I'm going to sort of go with a brief overview where starting in the 1960s, maybe if we can zoom into the 60s, you'll see a relationship that is kind of covert. There aren't official diplomatic channels established between India and Israel. So, and also India is still working hard to keep this strategic relationship with Israel under the wraps, while at the same time it still is gaining some mileage from providing lip service to the Palestinian cause. So it's still posturing as pro-Palestinian in rhetoric, as it is also posturing as anti-colonial in rhetoric, while engaging in some very, very colonial activities at home. Palestine is the cause that exemplifies that irony, that paradox within the Indian state. So 1960s is the time where India is at a territorial war with China, and they decide to procure weapons from Israel. And just an anecdote that to exemplify how important this covertness of the relationship was, in the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, in fact, requests the Israeli government that they send the weapons in an unmarked ship without the Israeli flag, so that the rest of the world doesn't really know that India is procuring weapons from Israel. But that is the reality. This procuring of weapons continues as India gets into further wars in 71 and 75 with Pakistan. And at the same time, what's going on at home is 1947, while providing lip service to the Palestinian cause, the Jammu massacres happened in Jammu and Kashmir. And similarly, there's some sort of during this period, India is still posturing itself as pro-Palestinian. So while the strategic relationship is deepening and India is procuring weapons from Israel, at the same time, it's gone ahead, and I think this is in the same time period, around what year? 74. India has gone ahead and voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution that categorizes Zionism as racism, and but at the same time, it's also abstained from some very important resolutions that involve investigations against war crimes that Israel is committing. So that's the sort of the first phase of covert relationship. The second part of this relationship starts around 1992, which is when India formally recognizes and establishes diplomatic relationships with Israel, which means that the ambassadors are exchanged, and so you no longer have to go through these backdoor channels. They've officially recognized Israel. This is also the time period where India has entered into the neoliberal world order and is trying to establish itself as an insider in this neoliberal imperial regime set up by the United States. So what you see in this time period is a more open weapons trade and economic collaboration, where India ends up becoming the largest buyer of Israeli weapons already. And so India has a need for technology, and Israel is willing to share those technologies. So it's a symbiotic relationship. They share technologies of surveillance. They share technologies about building fences, and all sorts of colonial tactics and shared strategies are really being fleshed out during this period. This is also the period where India is trying to deal with some acts of violence against itself, and is trying to position itself as an ally to the United States and Israel in the war against terror that the United States has launched. And so the lowest common denominator there being obviously Islamophobia. These countries have sort of come together again and launched this war on terror. So terrorism becomes something of a collaboration ground. And if you see, there's rhetoric of things that Israel and India are calling common enemy, which is they're mostly referring to the Muslim world. And so all of this is rooted in violent racism and Islamophobia. And so what has happened through this time as well, this is also the time period where India has been successfully able to use its relationship with Israel to position itself as a reliable ally, not only of Israel, but also the United States. So you see this is also the time period where the United States starts relaxing some sanctions that were imposed upon the Indian state. And they start openly talking about replicating Israel's killer instinct in India, especially in Kashmir. And so this is, and in addition, this is also the time period where you see Israeli weapons, in particular drones, being deployed in Chhattisgarh in India, where the Maoist insurgency is ongoing. So Israeli drones are now being used to hunt down Maoist insurgents and fighters. And then we finally enter the third phase of the relationship, starting almost around 2014 with the rise of Narendra Modi and the BJP government. And this is when you see a sort of a relationship that is an open embrace of Israeli colonial tactics. And there's unabashed just collaboration and cooperation that goes beyond just like arms trade and weapons trade, but the deep military collaborations. And not that there weren't military collaborations before this, right? Like in 1983, Indira Gandhi has already trained soldiers in Israel who are then used in 1984 to massacre hundreds of Sikhs in the Golden Temple in Amritsar under what was known as Operation Blue Star. When the Indian intelligence agency was set up by Indira Gandhi, amongst the first things she also did was establish direct relationships with the Israeli intelligence. So it's not like this military collaboration is just emerged from just out of Narendra Modi's tenure. BJP, which was already in power in the late 1990, in the 1990s, I think, ending 1998, L.K. Advani and Atal Bihari Vajpayee have sort of, the BJP government already then had started feeling a lot more confident about advancing their relationship with Israel. They were less afraid of the backlash, and so any sort of mileage or any benefit, strategic benefit that was coming to Israel from posturing itself as pro-Palestinian has been dwindling, and the strategic advantage, the military and economic advantage of cooperation with Israel has increased. And that's how India has made these strategic decisions towards aligning with Israel over Palestine. But what the Modi regime is finally bringing out is sort of a really open embrace between these two leaders that are openly, fielding ideas of ethno-supremacy, religious ethno-nationalism, and Islamophobia. So these become also populist figures, Netanyahu and Narendra Modi, who have the ideological alliance aspect sort of comes more into the forefront during the Modi regime. The other thing that comes into the forefront is the role of private capital. And this is the time period where you start seeing Indian private companies investing billions of dollars in Israel, most notably Adani Group, which ends up purchasing the Haifa port, which is one of the most important ports in Israel. You have other private companies like Tata, like Wipro, like Infosys, who start investing and buying all these companies in Israel. And vice versa, you see Israeli companies that are starting to invest in India, and there's a culture of collaboration that's getting deepened over time. The other thing that does happen is collaboration over labor and what nation states are beginning to these days call labor diplomacy. So the Indian government decides that it is all right to start replacing Palestinian workers with Indian workers. So there's this sort of really insidious, terrible collaboration between India and Israel, where India sort of supporting the ethnic cleansing campaign of India by replacing Palestinian workers with Indian workers who are also just, there's rampant unemployment. So these workers have really very limited choice and will go wherever the government is forcing them to go. So that's another form of collaboration that happens. And come 2023, you start seeing that Narendra Modi's government is amongst the first governments to come out and condemn resistance groups in Palestine for October 7th. They don't call for a ceasefire. They send drones and weapons. Now the relationship is kind of shifted, where Indian drones are being sent to Israel to murder Palestinians. So the relationship is now out in the open. Any lip service or any upholding of the Palestinian cause has completely gone out of the window. And this is a period where India while the 90s was a period where India was trying to enter the geopolitical sphere, this is the time period where India succeeded. And now you have a period of just two tyrannical governments collaborating, and that, in short, is the history of the collaboration between India and Israel. And you'll hear a lot more about this in a lot more depth, and I hope that this was able to provide just an overview so that you can, better get into the weeds of everything with Hafsa, Azad, and Aman and Nancy. So thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah. Thank you so much. That was amazing. In like 15 minutes, just taking us through from 1947 to now. That was incredible. So now that you all know all the facts and dates and the whole history, do we feel like we're feeling that in the room? Right? Yeah? Like, are we feeling that we know? Yeah, exactly. Basically, in short, fuck India. As a Sri Lankan, I'm very happy to say that every day. Now we're going to get into our panel discussion. I'm going to invite Mansi to the stage. She's going to facilitate this conversation. Aman, Hafsa and Azad, who are all going to come and speak more about their contributions. They contributed hugely to the issue, but also deeper, so that we can really get into, and into what we're talking here.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we're gonna have a small panel. I know it feels a little formal with us on the stage, but I don't want it to feel super formal. So we're gonna provide a little bit of the background and analysis here, a deeper background for us to really deepen our collective understanding in this room about the relationship between India and Israel, and the importance of India to Israel and vice versa. So here on our panel, we have Azad Essa, who's a senior reporter at the Middle East Eye, and he's the author of Hostile Homelands. We
Azad Hafsa Kanjwal, who's an associate professor of South Asian Studies at Lafayette College, and she's the author of Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation. And Aman Bardia, who's our SALAM representative. In political economy. All right. We got laughs on that. Okay, I think we want to get right into it. So I'll start with you, Azad. So we heard about from Ira the long timeline, the history of collaboration between India and Israel, and how the relationship has really expanded over the last few decades, how it's increased just exponentially under Modi. Can you expand a little bit on the underlying forces that have led to this? In other words, why is India important to Israel? Why is Israel important to India?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Salam and WAWOG for organizing the edition. When I started working on this book several years ago, there was very little appetite to hear about India and Israel, and so to see it like being, moving forward with something like this is more than I could have ever imagined. And I feel as if like, I need to speak louder. Okay. And so I'm very grateful for the effort that all of you are putting into this, because it is a topic that people do not expect to be discussing, right? When you think about Israel, you're thinking about the West, you're thinking about the US, you're thinking about 3.5 billion or whatever it is that the US sends to Israel. You're not thinking about another country, you're not thinking about India, associated with Bollywood and Gandhi and all the other, all of the other yeah, it's fine. Is it better? Okay. Yeah. So you're not imagining or not associating India with settler colonialism and with that type of oppression. So I think Ira did a fantastic job with the timeline. I almost feel as if I have nothing else to say, because when you look at that, when you look at the timeline and you see the different eras, it's really hard to make an argument that India is not so close to Israel. It's very difficult, all right? But I think there's a couple of things. I know we have limited time, so I'll try to be succinct about it. The first thing is that when India starts its relations with Israel militarily, right, it becomes very clear to the Indians that the Indian army, that they are on the wrong side of this dispute, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, we're going to call it that, right? And what I mean by that is that they feel as if there's more to gain by being with the Israelis, because the Arab world is so weak, so disorganized. And so they stick to the Arab world because of all the benefits that they are receiving from the Arab world, which is oil, which is also other kinds of currency, political currency, to work with the third world, right? What changes is in the 70s when Israel becomes a superpower in a way with regards to its military and technological advancements, or at least it's perceived to be, a big weapons manufacturer, and it seems it pushes this image that it's self-reliant. Meanwhile, it's getting all of this support from the West, right, to build its military base. India watches Israel grow, and in this regard, and they want to get closer to Israel, but they can't do so because of the economic dependence in terms of the oil. Plus, they have this political kind of the political baggage that comes from partition and comes from Nehru's policies. In the 90s, when the Cold War ends, and Israel then, and India and Israel become closer in terms of normalizing ties, what happens in Israel is that the arms industry privatizes. And India looks upon Israel as a country that they can collaborate with and that they can not only get arms, but also get technology to be transferred to India. And you must remember that at the time, Kashmir is, blowing up, and they are worried about not getting arms from Russia, right? Because Russia now is, Soviet Union ends, and they are concerned about the source of weapons. With Israel now developing its military-industrial complex to such an extent, India looks upon Israel to get those arms, and Israel looks upon India to not only subsidize the military-industrial complex, because now weapons are being sold to all of these countries, but they look at India as a country to which, if they become closer to, that will bring the entire so-called third world with them. So we're not talking about just India, we're talking about many African countries, we're talking about many parts of the Eastern Hemisphere as such, that will join, will come with India to look at Israel in a different light. At the same time, in the 90s, you have the neoliberalism that's growing within India itself, with the rise of the BJP and Hindu nationalism, and they start moving towards. That's not me. They start moving towards Israel to a large extent. And what happens in 1998 is that when India conducts nuclear tests, the US imposes sanctions on India. And the only country in the Western world, so-called Western world, that sticks to India at the time is Israel. And they come into service, or they come to India's aid in 99 when India goes to war with Pakistan. And they need help, and Israel is the one that provides that assistance. And if you may notice over the past 10 months or so, that has come up a bit. If you see the press in Israel or in India about how we should help Israel at this moment because they helped us back then. In the 2000s, what happens is that you have 9/11 that takes place over here, and India naturally veers towards joining the war on terror. And people don't understand that India actually joined the war on terror. It just didn't send troops to Afghanistan or Iraq, right? But it joins principally the war on terror, just as you have the Patriot Act in the US. You have, POTA, and what's the other one called? I forget. UAPA as well, right? So you have all of these India versions of the Patriot Act created in or passed in India. And the relationship between India and Israel explodes to an extent that people still don't understand that we think about arms being purchased worth around $1 billion a year today. But it started in 2002, 2003, $1 billion worth of arms being transferred to India from Israel. And that's when it starts. But the difference is that Manmohan Singh was a prime minister at the time, will not be seen with the Israeli government because of it's too much of a risk politically to be seen in that way. But in 2014 takes place, you have all of these worlds, collide. You have Hindu nationalists coming to power. You have Netanyahu, seen by this Hindu nationalist party, the BJP and the RSS, as a sort of militaristic leader, and Modi wants to replicate that. And so it's natural that they will form a bromance as such. Now, between 2014 and now, in the last 10 years, the relationship has now moved to almost like $2 billion of military exports to India. But more than that, you have universities joining arms with each other. You have universities working with like the Israeli aerospace industries. So what happens in 2017 and 2018 when Modi goes to Israel for the first time is for the first time an Indian prime minister goes to Israel, is that India and Israel form a strategic partnership. And when they do so, that means that India starts not just buying weapons, they start mass producing Israeli weapons. And at the time, people didn't really understand what would be the purpose of that, because they thought that it would just be part of India's or Modi's project of Make in India, indigenizing production. But actually, in the Israeli mind, what they were doing was that they're expanding the market of arms, but also expanding the production of arms. So when I say by market, weapons that people would not buy from Israel openly, right? They would now buy from India easily, right? And weapons that that were becoming too expensive to make in Israel would then be produced in India, and that would serve Israel at some point, and that point has come today. Whereas where we've seen drones being sent, combat drones sent in December, January, we've seen bombs and other kinds of parts being sent to Israel in January and February, even after the ICJ's ruling. What's remarkable about it is that as young people in the US and the UK and parts of Europe start mobilizing to try and shift the universities' sort of investments away from Israel, Israel has moved its emphasis to other parts of the world, including India. So in the past year or so, you've had like almost 20 meetings, MOUs, workshops between Israeli universities and Indian universities, especially the IITs in India. So the technological institutes, right? So they want to create a new generation of workers, tech workers, that would essentially be producing and basically creating a new ecosystem. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that they would replace the US or the West, but they're expanding just in case, essentially. So while we are mobilizing here, and one day, inshallah, like these divestments they already started, but these divestments will take place, then you have a new monster on the other side, and that's the actual danger here. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of the good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Azad. One more question for you, though. No, that was a really helpful to draw out how these collaborations came to be. But I do want to ask also, we know that the occupation forces in Kashmir and Palestine are also holding joint military exercises. They're using the same military infrastructure. They're sharing tactics and strategies. So could you talk a little bit about the project of the Indian state in Kashmir and how they're engaging with, how they're learning from the project of the Zionist entity in the occupation of Palestine? And vice versa.
Okay, so yeah, of course, Ira mentioned in the 2000s, one of the Indian ministers went to Israel and they essentially went to visit the occupied West Bank to look at the fences that were being built. And they essentially looked at the fences and said, we want to replicate this on the line of control with Pakistan. So they took it to Kashmir. And that has been essentially the model that India keeps on looking at Palestine and looking for ways in which they can replicate certain elements. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this whole, and I'll get into some of the other details, but what's also really interesting is that India also, it's not just about India copying Israel. India has its own set of policies and projects and ways of doing things. So for instance, whereas Israel, allows the internet in many ways to continue in Gaza, right? It cuts it at times and makes it difficult. And the West Bank, most of the time it continues, or being recently in Jenin, they cut it. India cuts it completely. And that shows you a little bit of a difference between the two, meaning that, and I've always found it very hard to understand why that is the case. So with India, they don't have that sort of esteem to show the world that this is what we are, this is what we are doing. Everything is very much like undercover. But with Israel, every attack, every kind of assault, every massacre is an advert for their weaponry, right? And so the way India does things and the way Israel does things are not completely the same. So this is not an argument that India copies everything that Israel does. But when you think about the way India and Israel, co-opt local actors to kind of govern, the local population. Like you have the PA in Palestine. In India, you have all of these Indian leaning politicians to govern. And that's a colonial policy. This is not something they invented. You also have laws that essentially allow the state to take away land, to confiscate land, just like in Palestine, and call it like sort of state land, call it, federal land. After 2019, India started doing that in Kashmir. You also have limitations on movement, right? So just as Palestinians are unable to move from one area to another area, or are blocked from leaving or from returning, Kashmiri passports are taken away. And they aren't able, they are no-fly list, but we wouldn't know about that, right? Now, just as you have settlements being built in the West Bank, and they have been going on for a long time, India has now spoken about building settlements in Kashmir as well, sort of Hindu-only settlements, in which there will be a demarcation, between Muslim Kashmiris and sort of Indians or Kashmiri Hindus, right? And Kashmiri Muslims have been saying for years that if Kashmiri Hindus want to return, they should return as equal citizens, not as people coming in, living in settlements. Anything else? Yeah. I think there's more, but I think this one.
Yeah, thanks, Azad. I want to pass it to Hafsa for the next one. Hafsa, adding to that, there's also a long history of solidarity between Palestine and Kashmir in response to some of these similar settler colonial strategies that are being used. Could you talk a bit about how this parallel history has played out and how it's shaped the resistance in both places?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming, and thank you also again to SALAM and WAWOG for hosting this event. So I'll answer this question. I'll try to be brief, and I'll answer it in two ways. One is talking about the actual shared histories or the parallels in the history, and the second is maybe developing a bit from what Azad just mentioned in terms of thinking through the modalities of control or the way in which the settler colonial control takes place. With the history, I mean, it's important to, of course, acknowledge that no two histories are the same. I mean, whenever on social media you have people trying to kind of link or Kashmiris expressing solidarity with Palestinians, you'll usually have like this Indian leftist who just wants to break the party and say, there's nothing, it's not similar. Like Kashmir is India's and that's it. And like this is, so there is an acknowledgement that this is something wrong going on in Palestine, but there's a really strong attempt to show that there's no parallels between the two or that there's no resonances. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. But there are a lot of resonances, even though, of course, things are not completely the same. And for me, what's really important is the ways in which it's driven by a very particular settler colonial logic and claims towards the land and who the land belongs to and who the land does not belong to. So of course we know what the Zionists, the idea is that Palestine or this was a Jewish homeland and that exclusively is a Jewish state and that's who it should belong to. With Kashmir as well, there are narratives, not just amongst Hindu nationalists, but also amongst Indian liberals and secular nationalists that argue that Kashmir was originally or authentically a Hindu homeland. And then there's this whole narrative of the Muslim invasions from Central Asia and so on and so forth, which we're familiar with in the context of the subcontinent more broadly. But again, this idea that this is a Jewish homeland and that this is part of a Hindu homeland, that's important. That's what drives the claim to the land. And that's what also drives these different ideologies to bring their masses into this project, right, on a very emotive and fundamental level. And then in addition to those claims, and those claims then also rely on a complete denial of indigeneity of Muslims or Muslim belonging, and especially in Kashmir, this idea that either the people were forcibly converted to Islam or that they don't belong there. And for a long time, though, I guess one of the main differences between the two is that India believed that it could assimilate Kashmiri Muslims. They thought that it was kind of more assimilative to the broader Indian project. Whereas, of course, as we know, the project in Palestine has always been eliminationist from the start. But I would say, in some ways, when you look at, I won't have the time to go into the different periods. There's always been attempts to kind of, in different moments, bring about more assimilation and elimination as settler colonial strategies in both contexts. So that's important too. Of course, in addition to these kinds of origin narratives and denial of indigeneity, there's also the role of British colonization. In Kashmir from the mid-1800s, when the British basically handed over Kashmir to a warlord, a Hindu warlord from the region of Jammu, who had no claims and no kind of previous association with the land. And then in the case, of course, as we know, Palestine in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. So the idea that this is also kind of derivative of a European colonial project, which also bolsters the claims of who this land belongs to. The British play a really critical role, British scholarship, British Orientalists, in kind of depicting or telling the history of Kashmir as being part of this broader Indic civilization. And so that is then what's internalized, of course, by later Indian nationalists as well. And then at the time of partition in 1947, there was a reference made to the Jammu massacre earlier. A lot of people, of course, know about the Nakba, but in the context of Kashmir, or the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, there was also a massacre in the region of Jammu, where the last princely ruler, Hari Singh, basically led an ethnic cleansing against Muslims who had led an uprising against his government. And so scholars say that there's around 250,000 people that were killed, Muslims, as well as an additional 250,000 that were then exiled into what is Azad Kashmir or other parts of Pakistan. And so this massacre, you would rarely, if ever, hear any Indian scholar, especially senior scholars, ever talk about it, because their whole story of what happened in Kashmir in 1947 begins with the so-called tribal invasion of the Pathans, who actually had come to assist Jammu's Muslims against the Dogra army. And so that's this moment of demographic change is already underway, where Jammu at that time was actually a Muslim majority region, and then became the Muslims became a minority, and it became a Hindu region, right, or Hindu majority region. And it sounds kind of it sounds a bit I don't know what the word is, but it doesn't sound nice to kind of talk about places just in terms of whether they're Hindu or Muslim, but it becomes important because that is how claims are made about them. And so because Jammu was now ethnically cleansed of its Muslims, the Indian state was able to say, look, this area in this broader princely state is Hindu. And so, no, there's no way that this whole region should go to Pakistan, right? So it was able to make that claim based on the demographics alone. After 1947, you have a series of different policies in Kashmir. The use of autonomy as a colonial tactic. Many of you may have heard about Article 370 and how it was an attempt by the state to kind of tell Kashmiris, the Indian states, to tell Kashmiris that they would have some semblance of autonomy under India. But in many ways, they looked beyond and found other ways to fully integrate Kashmir into the Indian state financially, legally, politically in the years following partition. And you also, of course, had the division of the territory after the first war between India and Pakistan. And then the other moments in which the kind of parallels are the most evident is in the late 1980s, where you have the first Intifada in Palestine, and then also the armed uprising in Kashmir in 1988 to 1989. And this is when Kashmir becomes incredibly militarized, and a lot of the similar images, if you go back and look at videos and images from that time, you'll just see, I mean, the immense level of militarization with almost 700,000 Indian soldiers that were brought to Kashmir to rule over this population and commit vast atrocities that include things like torture, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, home demolitions, rape and sexual violence that was used at that time. And so these are, of course, all familiar violations that you've heard that the Israeli army also has committed in Palestine. So we have a lot of those kinds of parallels in terms of the modalities of rule, but then people have resisted in similar ways as well. And I think it's also important to acknowledge how important the role of faith and especially people's Muslim identity has been in both struggles. And that's something that often does not get recognized or talked about, especially even, I mean, for me, the one thing that you keep seeing in Gaza these past 10 months is people's faith. I mean, that sticks out to me the most. And finally, as Azad mentioned, in 2019, there was the revocation of Kashmir's autonomy under Modi. And that is what, in many ways, has led to fears of the West Bankification of Kashmir, with the building of Hindu-only settlements. The autonomy that Kashmir was promised allowed for land to be only purchased by local residents, although there were ways that the Indian Army was still able to take over large tracts of land even before 2019. But at least there was the semblance that, you know, the explicit project of demographic change has not occurred in the valley as such. But now it's definitely well underway. And I'll maybe talk a little bit later about some of the changes that have happened in the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear about those, but in the interest of time, I'm just for now gonna turn to Aman to talk a little bit about the solidarity that we've seen, solidarity with Palestine that we have seen coming out of India. Of course, keeping in mind the contradictions that exist within the Indian left, right? Because of their refusal, sometimes inability, usually unwillingness to acknowledge the colonial nature, the settler colonial nature now of India's occupation in Palestine. So, but I do want to ask Ahmed to talk a little bit about the displays of solidarity, and not just the displays of solidarity, but why we haven't seen also that many mass demonstrations coming out in India.
Thank you, Maz. So I'm going to be very brief because I want to hear more from Azad and Hafsa, honestly. I have a few points to make. Historically, major trade unions and farmer unions and peasant unions across India have stood in solidarity with Palestine and for Palestinian liberation. And this has a really long history. So while this nation state of India pays lip service, there is an actual reality behind that also. It's not just hollow, it's not just geopolitical. There are masses of workers and peasants in India who have been in solidarity with Palestine since the Nakba. And I think it's very important to remember that. For instance, like recently, the largest peasants union in the country, All India Kisan Sabha, All India Peasants Union, in 2017 endorsed BDS, which is a huge thing. I mean, the largest peasants union means there are like more than 15 million peasants who are part of it, who it represents. So it's not something very small. And so while, militaries like Azad was talking about, there has been collaboration between the two militaries, between India and Israel. There has been collaboration between private capital across the two states. We also should remember that there has been much more collaborations than is visible from the other side for Palestine, from people like who live in India. And this doesn't necessarily always is visible on the streets. Like there are cultural collaborations as well. Like for instance, this amazing theater troupe called Jannatya Manch, based out of Delhi, frequently holds collaborations with the Freedom Theater in Jenin in Palestine. And there are many more such instances, like however scattered they are and not put together as a huge movement. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I mean, and that brings us to that question that, like, while there has been this history, why since October we haven't seen like massive demonstrations consistently on the streets across India in solidarity with Palestine? I think it's a very important thing to probe, and we can just try to understand this in a few ways. Now, one is that in the scale of like how strong the right wing is in India is really unprecedented. I think it's probably at its peak than it's ever been. The rise of fascistic forces is very strong. Like the current party in power, BJP, is affiliated with the Sangh Parivar, its ideological head, so to say, that runs the largest network of schools in the world. It's also the largest, it's also the richest party in the world. So they are highly resourced. They are very well organized. And they run the streets. And that's very important. And so when you, in this climate, the left has been on the back foot. The capacity for mobilizing and for doing political education is like, I would say, at an all-time low. And so when you ask, like, these leaders of these unions, of left-wing unions who have stood in solidarity with Palestine, like, why aren't there massive demonstrations happening like every day for Palestine? I mean, their response would be very weak. So to say, because the left is really weak. Because there's a growing fear within this context, which is where the right wing has completely dominated the narrative based on its strength, that they are afraid of being perceived as what, like Hafsa was talking about, as being perceived as anti-national and too Muslim. And it's something that we've heard over and over again in our conversations, even while, like, through the process of writing this piece. Like, we have a statement from All India Kisan Sabha, the same union that endorsed BDS in 2017 within this publication. And we've spoken to other leaders from across different left-wing trade unions, and they have said the same thing, that they're worried that they need to get a permit to do a demonstration, and if they don't get a permit, they're most likely to be arrested. And if they do have a demonstration, there would be a lot of people, like, who are visibly Muslim who would be on the streets, and that actually would, for them, the way they see it is that it would give more ammunition to right-wing forces to build on their Islamophobia. So this is a very real problem, and I think that's partly the reason that we can say that we haven't seen such demonstrations. The other is the left is also has recently been very inward-looking. Because they're on the back foot, and because, their internationalism is, I would say, at an all-time low. They recently, the elections happened in May a few months ago. So most of their energies were spent immobilizing the opposition for that election. That's also one of the reasons a lot of the comrades in India gave me. We have to keep in mind, India is the rise of fascism, capitalism there is really unprecedented. It's seeing the highest levels of inflation and unemployment seen in decades. So the situation is really bad. So within this context, they've been focusing much more on domestic issues, and only now, since the elections are over, there has been some steam gathering up for that. So, for instance, tomorrow there is a big rally that's been planned in Delhi by this group, a coalition called Indians for Palestine. But overall, I would say, in effect, they have been significantly reduced in strength and been reduced to symbolic gestures. So at the same time, what are these symbolic gestures, and what is the small strength that they have in which they have shown solidarity with Palestine? And there are quite a few moments that are very inspiring, since October of last year that we have seen. There was a garment manufacturing facility in Kerala, south of India, that manufactured uniforms for the Israeli police. They refused to do that. That was right in mid-October. They were like, we're not going to send any more uniforms to the Israeli police because of what they're doing, because of the genocide. The Construction Workers Federation of India, Ira was talking about how India was sending thousands of workers to replace Palestinian workers who have been denied and work permits, and they have been refused for their work permits to be renewed. So the Construction Workers Federation of India, which represents the largest union of construction workers in the country, they issued a statement to refuse sending any construction workers to Israel. And this was back in December, before the deal was even put in place between India and Israel. The Water Transport Federation of India, like as we've learned, like how much weapons get sent from being manufactured in India to the Zionist entity. And so the Water Workers Federation of India represents the largest union of port workers across the country. They refuse to load any weapons that are headed to Israel. They refuse to unload any weapons that are coming from Israel. So these are significant developments, however small and scattered they are within the broader, political calculus of the different left forces that we are seeing. And I think they need to be mentioned. And there have also been workers from the large trade unions, the CITU, for instance, AIKS and NTUI, like many other trade unions, or left-wing trade unions, communist trade unions, that have been holding, while there haven't been massive demonstrations on the streets, they have been doing a lot of work in more indoor gatherings of small scale public education. Small scale here means up to 1,000 people. That have been repeatedly having hall meetings, as they call it. They have been distributing pamphlets for political education on what's going on in Palestine. Just to summarize, so to say that there is a long history. The left is very weak, the right wing is very small. The left is very weak, the right wing is huge and is very powerful. And so within these conditions, I think there is a growing momentum, but not as big as we would like to see it, and not as big as they should be seen, honestly.
Yeah, thank you. I think you all summed up a lot of this history and the present moment really well. So thank you all for that. I want to take a few questions from the audience. I don't think we have a lot of time, but maybe if we can get, thank you to the timekeeper who just suddenly started doing his job.
I can pass on the mic. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
I can take 3 questions. Yeah. We have one. I think we can take 3 at once and then just.
Hi, I have a question following up on the comment about the construction workers strike. So in the issue of the war crimes, there's a small mention of some 24,000 workers who have been sent to Israel. What do we know, or what can be said about the experiences of care workers and construction workers who have been living in Israel since 2023 or before, as well as the experiences of the communities that they're leaving from?
Thank you. So sorry, I'm just going to repeat each question when we get it. So what is the experience of the 24,000 care workers who have been sent to Israel? Go ahead.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can speak to the state of India's media coverage over Palestine and maybe some parallels between what we see in the US.
Thank you. Some parallels between India's media coverage of Palestine and what we're seeing here in the US. And a last question.
Thank you so much, Hafsa, Azad, and Aman. My question is to Aman. I was very eagerly waiting for Aman to comment on the lack of solidarity for Kashmir, because the question was framed as the fact that there is solidarity, however small, however little, for Palestine in India. Why do we find a lack of that solidarity when it comes to Kashmir? And when there is solidarity, it always comes at an expense of voices on the ground. What I have in mind is Indian academics as well as the JNU leftist movement, 2016, the antagonist of America. So thank you. I could talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have 3 questions. I don't know who wants to take which one, but one about the 24,000 care workers who have been sent and what their experiences are. One about the Indian media coverage of Palestine and the parallels between Indian media coverage and what we're seeing here in the US. And one about the lack of solidarity for Kashmir that we see amongst Indians in general, and I'm hearing in particular the Indian intelligentsia. Someone want to start?
Okay, so on the construction workers, when India sends over workers to different parts of the globe, right? It normally creates some kind of relationship with the state, and they offer some kind of insurance, like health insurance or security in terms of safety, right? To ensure that if they're not going to send people to a war zone as such, but they made an exception for the construction workers to go to Israel. So when they went to Israel, they got there and they realized that they were in hell. And there have been not many stories about it, but there have been accounts of them not enjoying their time there and realizing that they have gone there as sort of like indentured labor. And I think that's one of the stories that hasn't really been properly told. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you also got to think about the ecosystem between India, the UAE, in terms of the Gulf, and Israel, and how Israel trying to replicate that kind of indentured labor that the Gulf also has used to kind of build their economy. And they look on to India as, India is not a democracy. It's run by oligarchies, right? In that way, it's close to like a Russia in that way, right? And it's an authoritarian capitalistic state. So when you talk about kind of what Aman's mentioning about these unions that are speaking out and all of that, much of this information that we are talking about now is not in the media, right? It's not in the media, and it's kind of buried, and it's also these unions are also emptied out in many ways. So even those port workers that Aman spoke about, that said that they're not going to load weapons. No one asked them to load weapons. They were government port workers. All the weapons that are being loaded were done by private ports, where they can't unionize. So all run by Adani. Okay, so those government ports are irrelevant because it's done somewhere else. That's not how it's narrated in the media as well. So the independent Indian media, as such, The Wire or Scroll or whatever limitations that they have tried to cover it. They've tried to talk about these issues and talk about these linkages, but they have their limits also when it comes to some of these things, because ultimately they have this nationalistic discourse. There is this thing linked to the Indian military, the Indian security, the Indian national interest. But the right-wing media or mainstream media have been horrific. In many ways, they're worse than the US press. They've been pushing like these labels that go beyond just calling someone like a terrorist. It's beyond that. And they have been manufacturing consent for India's relationship with Israel continuing. And it goes back to my original point about the oligarchy and the authoritarian capitalism, because what we are seeing is that India has had an explosion of billionaires over the past 5-10 years. And that means that everything is controlled by them. So the narrative is controlled by them, the economy is controlled by them. And so that means that all of these other things with regards to the relations with other states and with regards to labor is all dictated to by these billionaires. So these billionaires all want to be like, Elon Musk and Bezos or whatever the guy's name is. Sorry. They they want to emulate that, and in this way, um, much of the media is replicating the Indian national interest in that way. So we're not getting an honest reflection of what it means even for India, should the ICJ one day finally say that this is a genocide for sure. And all of these companies are going to be in trouble, even if nothing happens to them, but they'll be paying through it. But that is not even a discussion in most of the Indian mainstream media. I don't know if that answers the second question also. But yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know how many of y'all know this, but there used to be a much popular acronym like PEP, where people would say people are progressive except Palestine, particularly in the US. So I think there should be something similar for Indian leftists. It's like PEK, progressive except Kashmir. Except that, the situation is much worse. And when it comes to the question of Kashmir, in terms of the national consciousness, or in terms of like any kind of like, from the opposition, anything that's not the right wing, to think about Kashmir is not an integral part of India. Like you find very few people like who would publicly do that, let alone organizations. So it's I don't know what to say. It's very insidious. I think the right wing is very strong, and I think it's particularly a feature of that, that it's managed to grow so much that there is no discussion of Kashmir like that. There is no movement within India, like beyond, like, say a few hundred people at max, that could openly say that we are for the self-determination of Kashmir, and that Kashmir is an occupation. I mean, you would go to jail like very soon if you do that. But nevertheless, it is a very sad reality.
Maybe add to this a bit. So in terms of the left, I think there's two things to keep in mind in India, and I'm making generalizations because it is what it is. I think they're still deeply nationalistic, right? So they still are attached to an idea of India. And I think that is, of course, what allows them to then not see Kashmir as an occupation or not see the Indian state as a colonial power in Kashmir. But they're also deeply Islamophobic. And we know this because we've dealt with the left here, which is also Islamophobic. And there's always tensions within movements about this one issue. But in India, I think the Islamophobia is even more deep-rooted. And so I've heard a number of academics, unfortunately, I am in academia, so Indian scholars, especially senior scholars, tell me to my face that they support Palestine, but they won't support Kashmir because it's a religious, and even using the word terroristic. I mean, these are people who evidently support Palestine, but that's a religious or terrorist struggle. And you're just kind of like baffled by that. There's people who I've seen wear keffiyehs or don, their pro-Palestinian sentiments, and they've denied or not allowed events on Kashmir on their campuses because they're heads of certain South Asia institutes. So this is the kind of complete hypocrisy we're dealing with. And so for sure, that deep-rooted Islamophobia, the upper caste nature of so much of Indian academia, especially in the US, needs to be challenged, and it is being challenged. But of course, many of the people who are challenging it don't have access to the kind of gatekeeping that a lot of these senior people do. And then I would say, finally, the reason why I think this is really important, and why I don't consider it whataboutery when people mention, why are you talking about Palestine but you're not talking about Kashmir? Because if Palestine is really the paradigm, and it's supposed to set us free, and it's supposed to liberate all of us, then what does that mean? How are you not confronting the little Israels in your own world? And so I think that's why this question is actually really important. And there needs to be no, I don't think anyone needs to be apologetic about confronting or pointing out that hypocrisy.
I think just to close us out, I want to bring us back to the U.S. for 1 minute, if it's okay. And just, would one of you be able to just speak for, 1 or 2 minutes about what is the importance of the U.S. here in this relationship between India and Israel, and what is the importance of the diaspora? Because we know that the Hindu right has taken a lot of inspiration from the Zionist lobby. We know that the U.S. is not just a hosting ground, but also a facilitator for this relationship between India and Israel. So I want, just to understand in a couple of minutes what the importance is of us being here, situated here in the U.S.
Each of these are like chapters, so that's why it's very difficult to summarize. I actually want to say one more thing about the Indian media. I'm not trying to shit on them. It's important, and that is they've also they've also been emulating kind of like this Western model of this deep hypocrisy when it comes to saying one thing and doing another thing. So they are operating on the IR model, the international relations model, in which we say that no, we believe in a two-state solution, we believe in the right to Palestinian self-determination, and we give charity to Palestine, which is like $2-3 million a year, but then they are buying arms worth $1 billion a year. So when people criticize, and the book Hostile Homelands and other people have criticized India's policies towards Palestine, towards Israel, and their changing policy towards Palestine, the rebuttal that we get is that no, India's foreign policy hasn't changed; it's still the same, and that is a page that they take from the U.S. media as well as also U.S. foreign policy as well. It's like whenever anything happens, when this Turkish American activist was killed today, you see what the State Department said. It was like, we care about American lives. I mean, whatever. We're also going to investigate this. So we're going to get back. We're going to check up what has happened because. And sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought here. But ultimately, none of that actually matters, right? So the Indian media has been playing this game with that in terms of reporting, and so it confuses a lot of people who are not politically educated or politically literate to understand that this is a game, this is spin. So that's one thing. In terms of the Indian diaspora, I don't know where to start. So this is also a long-term project. Something that has, we have to go back to the 70s if you really want to understand it. When Indira Gandhi, what did she do? No, not wrong. when Indira Gandhi sort of canceled the constitution, the emergency law, right? And essentially what happened is that many people ran away from India and set up shop in the US. Many right-wingers came and did that. And so in the 90s, these right-wing Hindu nationalists who have been living now here in the US for 20, 30 years, they had come, they had wealth now, but they had no political sort of like influence. And when India and Israel start talking to each other, these Hindu nationalists become fundamental to this project because they see Hindu nationalism, growing back home in India, and Hindu nationalism is linked to the neoliberal project back home. And so this means that things are opening. We're going to be selling out, farms and manufacturing and factories and all these things to private companies, and they have dollars, so they will invest back home in India, and they're going to own all of that. And so they connect with the Hindu nationalists, and many of them are already. And they also then look at, they buy into the anti-Semitic trope of Jews controlling things, right? So they look at the Jewish community, right? But they mean the Zionists. They look at the Zionist community and they go, how is this small community have such an outsized influence over the U.S., not understanding that Israel is an outpost of empire, right? So then they work with the Israelis, they work with the ADL, they work with the APAC, they work with all these organizations, and they become close. And I've got 30 seconds left, but ultimately, in the last 10 years, all of that has come to fruition, essentially. So they are copying all of those tactics. And so as you have the era, IHRA's definition when it comes to anti-Semitism, be compared to anti-Zionism, you will one day or soon be told that you can't talk about Hindutva. So that's where we are headed.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here and for answering all those questions and for your wonderful answers. I think we're out of time for this portion, so I'm just going to pass it to Mikey to close us up.
Thank you so much. Although that was like kind of pretty depressing, it was really nice to hear from all of you all. Now we're just going to hear, finally, I know we've kept you just for the next sort of 5 minutes, just another comment from Salam, because as we hear about the Indian and broader South Asian diaspora in the US, there is stuff we can do. We need to like fuck this shit up, and we're going to hear how to do that.
But as we're coming to close, please stay put as we're about to introduce our campaign. Thank you all for your patience. Shout out to those waiting downstairs in line. Let's give another round of applause to our amazing speakers and panelists. So firstly, we have some announcements. Please be sure to check out Hafsa and Azad's book, respectively titled Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation in Hostile Homelands, the New Alliance Between India and Israel. Azad will be selling his book tonight in the back, as well as a children's coloring book. You can see our comrade over there holding it up, focused on Palestine, titled From the River to the Sea, a coloring book. You can also find the children's book at 1804 Books. So please cop yourself a copy. And finally, you may have seen a QR code circulating around labeled Palestinian Journal Syndicate, which links to a Venmo, which we are collecting funds to support the continued vital work of investigating the Zionist entities targeting of Palestinian journalists. So please be sure to show your support. How is everyone feeling? Good? All right, so before we begin, I wanted to start off with some chants in Urdu, but I need your participation. I want you to reply to each demand by using the phrase Azadi, which translates to freedom. Got it?
Yes.
All right, let's give it a try. हम क्या चाहते हैं? आजादी। हम छीन के लेंगे। आजादी। हम छीन के लेंगे। आजादी। है हक हमारा। आजादी। है हक हमारा। आजादी। है जान से प्यारी। आजादी। है प्यारी प्यारी। आजादी। इस जंग और जुबर से। आजादी। इस जुल्म सितम से। आजादी। जरा जोर से बोलो। आजादी। जरा जोर से बोलो। आजादी। फलस्तीन की नारा। आजादी। फलस्तीन की नारा। आजादी। कश्मीर की नारा। आजादी। कश्मीर की नारा। आजादी। Good job, guys. Welcome back. Good evening, everyone. As a reminder, we are SALAM. We're an org based here in New York City, committed to building the South Asian left. And when we say left, we mean the one situated in the history of struggle. The struggle against imperialism, against classism, classism, and more. From South Jamaica to the Bronx, we know that working class people have been at the forefront of our struggle for decades. We want this campaign to be a campaign of consciousness, collaboration, and community with one another. And we released the Salam-specific issue of the New York war crimes to detail the struggle from Kashmir to Palestine, the struggle against Hindutva and Zionism, and to spotlight the alliance between India and Israel, but also to announce the launch of our campaign, Tata Bye Bye. As we've learned today, we know India's bloody embrace of Israel has a long history, and we continue to see a resurgence of this unholy alliance. We know the capitalist class defends its violent interests in maintaining the settler war machine. Primary examples of India's private capital investment in the Zionist entity include Adani, Wipro, Mahindra, Infosys, and Tata. So today, as we announce Tata as the company we wish to strike, Tata bye-bye as we like to call it, you may be wondering, why focus on Tata? Well, Tata is often credited for laying the foundations of Indian capitalism. Tata was founded pre-independence with the blessings of the British Raj and is known colloquially as the salt-to-software conglomerate, encompassing over 100 businesses. From greenwashing and more, Tata loves to parade itself as a false image of benevolent industrialism and philanthropic community building. And speaking of parades, shout out to the successful disruption of the India Day Parade and rejection of the Ram Mandir cult on display, as you may have seen on social media. We know from the stolen lands of India to the occupied territories in Palestine, Tata actively engages in the genocidal infrastructure. They're an empire built on the exploitation of labor and loss of life. But while Tata and the Zionist entity chooses death and destruction, we choose life and liberation. Back in India, Tata's factories occupy stolen land from the Adivasis. When these indigenous tribes protest, Tata collaborates with the Indian Army by supplying the army with critical tools to continue the state-sanctioned violence against these tribes and the Maoists in central India and those in occupied Kashmir. The violence that Tata breeds in India is then replicated abroad within the Zionist entity. From sending weapons components to supplying armored vehicles to producing banking services to maintaining Project Nimbus, Tata is responsible for much of the infrastructure for the genocide in Gaza and all other parts of Palestine. Simply put, Tata is complicit, Tata lies, and Tata is close by. Tata's infrastructure of death is not only a roadmap of complicity, but a roadmap for action. Here in the belly of the beast, Tata Group and the Tata Consultancy Services, also known as TCS, has major operations. Tata is the largest Indian sponsor of H-1B1 visas, and in New York City, Tata Group and TCS has offices and facilities, including their Cornell's Tech Roosevelt Island campus. TCS also serves as a primary sponsor for the New York City Marathon in November. Shame! We call on the marathon organizers, to New York Roadrunners, to drop this partnership. Let's just say, in the weeks to come, Tata has a run for their blood money. So stay tuned, grab your copy of the New York War Crimes on your way out, or send a link to your friends at newyorkwarcrimes.com. And for regular updates of our Tata Bye Bye campaign, make sure you follow us at SALAM on Instagram, that's at South Asian Left, and make sure you scan our QR code and sign up to our mailing list, indiaisrael.org. And if there are any other orgs here interested in getting more involved, let's talk. And of course, please make sure you follow our partners, of which tonight's event and issue would not be possible. And before we close out with another chant, let's give another round of applause to our amazing panelists, Hafsa and Azad, as well as our incredible event organizers and facilitators. Thank you to the Asian American Writers Collective for hosting us. Thank you to Jamar Media for the live stream, hi chat, and WAWOG for this collaboration on the SALAM specific issue of the New York War Crimes. Please be mindful of the space as we leave, and make sure you throw your cups and plates in the trash before you leave. Thank you everyone again for joining us this evening, and we'll see you soon. And let's let Tata know that time is up, or Tata Bye Bye, as we like to call it. Ready for a final chance? Can we stand up if you are able to? Ready? Occupation is a crime.
Occupation is a crime.
Kashmir to Palestine.
From Kashmir to Palestine.
Occupation is a crime.
Occupation is a crime.
Kashmir to Palestine.
From Kashmir to Palestine.
Free the people, free the land.
Free the judge you with genocide.
Where's the consultancy you can hide?
That's the consultancy you can hide.
We judge you with genocide.
We judge you with genocide.
That's our bye-bye.
That's our bye-bye. Thank you.
Just one more quick thing before we go. The flyer that we mentioned before for the syndicate, the QR code is right here on the bottom. Don't put anything on the fence.
I hit like, whoa.
Flag it, but just say like SALAM event or something to that nature to get this out.